Welcome to the second session of Unpacking General Convention. I'm Seth Olson. I have the gift of serving as the rector of Holy Apostles here in Hoover, Alabama. And in this session, we will be talking about some of the elections that happened at the 81st General Convention up in Louisville, Kentucky. We'll even hear a little snippet of something that the new presiding bishop, the presiding bishop-elect Sean Rowe, shared a while back. And it's a good conversation about the process of how these elections can unfold, and also some of the challenges that exist when mixing something as political as elections with something as holy as the church. So I hope you'll enjoy, and I hope if you're in the Birmingham area, you'll come and check us out. We have worship at 10:30 on Sunday mornings. We have some Christian formation throughout the week. We have a Bible study at 10:30 on Tuesdays and centering prayer at 10:30 on Thursdays. For more information, check us out online, holyapostleshoover.org, or visit us on Facebook. Hope you'll have a great day, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the second session of Unpacking General Convention. I'm grateful y'all have come back, and we're back together. Let's open with prayer, and this is adapted from our prayer book's prayer for clergy and people. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty and everlasting God, from whom comes every good and fulfilling gift, send down upon our church's leaders, bishops, other clergy, and the congregations committed to their charge, the healthful spirit of your grace, and that they may truly please you. Pour upon them the continual dew of your blessing. Grant this, O Lord, for the honor of our advocate and mediator, Jesus Christ. Amen. All right. I enjoy that prayer, particularly because we don't get to say phrases like the continual dew of your blessing often enough in my mind. So grateful to hear phrases like that our prayer book gifts us. This is a quick review of what we covered last week, but as a reminder, if you have any questions or if something's kind of bubbled up between last week and this week, please stop me and ask your question, because I know at one of the legislative committee's meetings that I went to, somebody asked a question. Actually, it was like this whole series of people asking these questions, and every one of us was kind of prefacing it by saying, I'm sorry, this is something I should know, or this is a dumb question. But the committee's chairperson, a priest named Emily Malott, said, you know what, there's no dumb questions here. Like, this is complicated church governance, and so if you have a question, please feel free to ask it, and you don't even have to preface it by saying, I should know this, because you don't. You shouldn't. I mean, there's many things that even lifelong Episcopalians or people who've been to 15 general conventions don't really know, because it's an ever-changing thing, too. So this is a quick review. What is General Convention? It's the governing body of the Episcopal Church. It meets every 3 years, and you'll recall it's a bicameral legislature comprised of two houses, the House of Bishops and the House of Deputies, and those are made up from bishops and deputies, both clergy and lay, from every diocese, so 100 and something. I need to do a little math, because we consolidated some dioceses and we added a new diocese, so I don't know the exact number of how many dioceses we have anymore. It was something like 108 with 3 missional territories before, and now that math is not quite right. The math is not quite mathing, as they say. And then between conventions, there's this body called Executive Council, made up of about 40 people. Most of those, 20 of those, are elected, alternating 10 at one general convention, 10 at the next, and then there's 18 members that are elected by the different provinces throughout the Episcopal Church. So any questions about kind of what General Convention is? All right, what's the deeper purpose of General Convention? We believe it's the ultimate temporal authority of the Episcopal Church, and it's how we in the church express the good news of God's love through the actions of General Convention, and that's usually through things like resolutions and elections. Told y'all, and I'll plug this for next week, because next week we'll be talking about resolutions. This week we're going to be talking about elections. Everybody loves an election, right? Maybe not. It's a tough year for us all to stay together. But yeah, so we'll look at elections today. Next week we'll talk about resolutions. And one of the things that's really interesting about what we do in the Episcopal Church is there's an additional thing called memorials, which are not, they don't carry any weight, but they're kind of often letters written to the wider church is essentially what a memorial is. So for example, the Young Adult Caucus, which is made up of people 40 years and younger, so I get to be a part of that for another 3 months. 3.5 months. So, or 2.5 months. So, yeah, we wrote a memorial. We wrote a letter that was a memorial that was asking the wider church to rethink the way that disciplinary canons are implemented, because there's been all this kind of fuss around the church that when bishops undergo what's called a Title IV investigation. Title IV is the disciplinary canons of the Episcopal Church. When they undergo that, often their hands are in the process, right? Because they're bishops, and so they're the ones choosing intake officers who would hear that complaint. So there's some messiness with the system. And so we wrote a memorial just to kind of ask, not necessarily to put forth a resolution, but just for us as a church to kind of rethink some of these things. So yeah, a little different. All right, so should we talk about some elections in the Episcopal Church? Yes? All right, let's keep going. So the big election that happened at this General Convention, the one that kind of garnered the most headlines, was the election of our 28th presiding bishop. And before we could elect a presiding bishop, we had to do all of these different things. So we're going to walk through the steps that it took to get to electing our 28th presiding bishop. And each of these steps, you know, some of these steps are moments long and some of these are months long. But hopefully you'll get a sense that, at least in this election, it's not like thrown together last minute. It's a very prayerful process. It's a very holy process, and it, to me, felt that way the entire time that we, as a whole church, were kind of walking through this. So this started way back in May of 2021. So a couple months. Cast your mind back to May of 2021. What a crazy time we were living in. I remember I was a couple months removed from getting, my COVID shots, right? Those for that first round of COVID shots, we were probably, at least I was praising God that in a year's time, scientists and public health folks had gotten those shots out there, so it was pretty powerful. But at that time, we were so unsure about how the General Convention, the 80th General Convention, was going to take shape. And so we were looking ahead because we knew that in 2024, we were going to be electing a new presiding bishop. But you have to have a joint nominating committee that's going to put forth names for that. And they need 3 years to get ready for that. So we were about to kick General Convention 80 down the road to 2022 instead of 2021. So in May of 2021, we had to figure out how are we going to elect this joint nominating committee, because they got to go ahead and start their work. So for I think it was at least a month long, every Tuesday, the deputies that had been duly elected to serve at General Convention 80 would receive an email from a service called Election Buddy. And so we would get our Election Buddy email, and we would go through and we would vote for the people that we wanted to serve on the joint nominating committee. And so it took a while for us to fill all those vacancies. Some people were elected on the first ballot, but it took several times to get through and to finally elect everyone. One of the funny things is, and deputies would elect the deputies, the non-bishop clergy and the lay people to serve on that, and bishops would elect the bishops that would serve on the joint nominating committee. So when the committee was announced, one of the names that I looked at and was like, oh, this is interesting that this person's on there, was Bishop Rob Wright from the Diocese of Atlanta. And I was like, oh, he's serving on the joint nominating committee. I thought he might put himself forth to run for the next presiding bishop. Well, that is what happened, and so his name eventually disappeared from the list. And this is the group of folks that was elected. And so you'll see that we have these little Roman numeral numbers beside people's names. You'll see those Roman numerals. So these are their provinces, and so there's somebody from every province serving on this. So we're Province 4. So if you go down, you'll see the Reverend Deborah Jackson, who's wonderful, and she's from Florida, but she ended up being the chaplain of the whole group. So we were well represented by her. We also had the Right Reverend Phoebe Roth, who's been here. Y'all remember she came here and she received y'all into so Shane and Shannon know personally the power of Bishop Roth. So we had some good representation, some folks that really care about our part of the world. We also had Mr. Eric Bailey from Central Florida. So those are the folks nearby, but all of these deputies and bishops who served on this committee, I think, did a really good job of taking this very seriously. I'll tell you more about some of that in a little bit, but it was clear that they were prayerful and intentional in this process. And here's a picture of all the good folks who were serving on here. And so this is a kind of an overview of what will happen. I'll go back to our little checklist on the process in just a second. But in 2023, from May 15th to July 15th, the committee received names. So they kind of opened up this process and they said, anybody who wants to put forth a name of a bishop who would become the next presiding bishop could do so. I don't know if canonically that it's not possible for somebody to put forth the name of somebody that's not already a bishop. I think you already have to have that experience at this point, but I can't remember if there's an actual canon dictating that. Now, if you can think way back, Ambrose of Milan, way back in church history, I think was not even a priest and was elected to be the Pope. So we do have history in the church that people get this kind of a quick ascension, and so one day you're doing the ordination for a deacon, the next day you're doing the ordination for a priest, the next day you're doing the ordination for a bishop, the next day you're installing that person as the Pope. Can you imagine that sort of thing? I mean, these different times in the past. So we received those, or the Joint Nominating Committee received those names. They also did a good job of talking with our current presiding bishop, Michael Curry, and previous presiding bishop, Catherine Jeffrett Shorey, as well as their staffs, to see what would be helpful. And then the final thing they did, and y'all may have been a part of this, in October of 2022, they put forth a survey, and they got over 6,000 responses from Episcopalians about what they hope for in the next presiding bishop. So they really did try to get feedback from not just the people on the committee or just this kind of group, but they looked more globally, and I think they did a good job of trying to figure out what the will of the church is. And so then so we've elected the Joint Nominating Committee. We're in the process of kind of outlining what we think the gifts of these candidates should be. And then there's this discernment process that was taking place. And so the committee in 2023 spent September meeting in St. Louis, September 6th through 9th, met in St. Louis, Missouri. And so at that point, they had received, I don't know if they'd received 111 names, but 111 Episcopalians submitted bishops' names. Some of those bishops might have been the same bishop. So the committee invited those bishops all to enter the discernment process, and those who agreed then, like that wanted to keep going in the process, would submit biographical information, references, and then they had a written and a video response to several questions. And those videos and written materials in the bishop's applications helped the committee to figure out who they wanted to invite deeper into the process. They would do virtual interviews in the fall of 2023. Then January 9th through 11th this year, they met in Phoenix, Arizona, and they chose which bishops to invite to an in-person kind of a retreat, a face-to-face meeting in March of 2024. And so then, finally, in April, not on April 1st, because they were afraid that people would think that the candidates were an April Fool's joke, but on April 2nd, they announced 4 candidates. And literally the chair said this to us, that they were afraid that if they put it out on April 1st, people would be like, wait, are these actually the candidates? So it was a funny moment of levity. And so... I don't know. They didn't speak about how many people were kind of seriously considered. I would think it would be in the ballpark of a few dozen. Because, the crazy thing is, and y'all know this because we've had some good bishops here. Bishop Parsley was almost our presiding bishop. Y'all may know that way back when. But different bishops have all these particular gifts, right? And some of them might be fitting for the time that we are in, and some might not. I think there is so much to be considered, but there's so many qualified bishops, and almost every time I interact with a new bishop, like it was always fun to kind of bump into different bishops, and you kind of know them by reputation. And most of the time when I've met different bishops, my expectation of them was not high enough. They impressed me beyond their kind of what their persona is out in the public eye. So I would guess that there are a few dozen that were seriously considered. Yeah, Gail.
Does anybody ever say, no, I do not want to be bishop?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yes, I think the story. I think it was Russell Kendrick, who's the bishop of the Central Gulf Coast. I think he told me this story that he was asked like 3 times before he finally considered it. I think Key also, it was like it took him a while. Bishop Key, like people were saying like you should run, and he was like, no, I don't want to do that. And it took 3 different people saying yes, you really should. For him to finally say yes. So I would imagine even in this process especially, it was even more, more discernment to be done, because you are becoming, when you're the bishop, when you're the bishop of a diocese, you're the pastor to all those clergy, who are pastors to all the people. Now, we would also consider our bishop pastor to everyone, yes. But particularly, they're caring for the clergy. And so the bishop, the presiding bishop, is charged with caring for all those clergy. And you just think about the weight of what each bishop is carrying around. It's not an easy task. So I think to be even considering doing this, you'd have to be very self-assured and kind of trusting of your own internal call, is my sense. So here are the 4 candidates who were initially announced. Scott Baker from Nebraska, Daniel Gutierrez from Pennsylvania. He was the canon in New Mexico before that. Sean Rowe from northwestern, I'm trying to remember if he's from northwestern Pennsylvania and then is the bishop provisional for Western New York. But he's bishop of both of those dioceses, and they do a lot of work together since they're geographically very, very close. And then Rob Wright, who was initially on the Joint Nominating Committee and then now off because he felt the call to serve, or to at least put his name forth into discernment. So, it's a hard thing to do that discernment, and I think all four of these men that put themselves forth, I think were really good candidates and had a lot of impressive gifts that would be fitting for where we are in this moment of the church. Does that kind of answer your question, Gil? Okay. So we have these four, but if you recall, if we go back to our process list, there's this important step of having a petitioning period. So we had the 111 names that were put forth. And then all these people went through the discernment process. And then there's background checks and psychological evaluations and a physical that's conducted, all these sorts of things to make sure that these people are fit to serve in this capacity. But even then, if it felt like the will of the church was not expressed in the candidates, the slate of candidates, there's this petitioning process. So on April 2nd, after the Joint Nominating Committee announced the slate of four candidates, and canonically they only have to turn over 3 names, but they submitted 4. The immediate backlash, can you all guess what the immediate backlash was? There's no woman, right? Like we have 4 dudes, right? There's no women. 30% of all bishops and 40% of all Episcopal clergy are women. So it makes sense to point this out, that there's got to be a female candidate. So that's why there's a petition process, right? Because even all the intentionality in the world may not lead to something happening that we feel is very fitting. So from April 3rd to April 15th, the committee received names during what was called the intent to nominate period. And so from that process emerged another candidate, the Right Reverend D.D. Duncan Proby of the Diocese of Central New York. And D.D., as you can tell by the background of these pictures, was already at that discernment retreat. And she didn't feel like she wanted to put her name forth, even though I think the committee was maybe willing to. And so when she, this is, I'm not sure this is gospel truth. This is like third or fourth hand accounts. But supposedly, once this happened and there were no females on there, Dee Dee was approached and she was like, yes, of course, put my name forth. Because she thought somebody else was maybe going to be put forth instead. But she and her gifts were impressive as well. So, I mean, all of these candidates had requisite experience, had success in their diocese, had been doing a lot of things that the larger church was kind of putting forth, so you could tell that they're kind of in touch with what's going on more globally. And so we had 5 candidates. But you may have read that 3 of the 5 had disciplinary Title IV violations that were being kind of adjudicated. And so there was this whole hubbub, right? And that the 3 that had violations, and this is how I'm reading this, were Daniel Gutierrez, D.D. Duncan Proby, and Robert Wright, the 3 non-white male candidates. There's something weird going on here. But there's a question of were the Title IV canons being used inappropriately to try to dismiss certain candidates off of the slate? There's a question about that. So if you looked deeper into those Title IV complaints, Gutierrez was about mishandling a Title IV violation by a clergy person in his diocese from 3 years ago that had already been handled. And then Proby was wrong. It was stated that she wrongfully cited something on her resume but that was dismissed in a previous case as well. And then Rob Wright had a very public case that was put forth in December of 2023 and dismissed by February. It was a previous employee. If y'all remember, we read Catherine Meek's work during Lent. We read that book. Well, she was the director of the Center for Racial Justice, the Absalom Jones Center in Atlanta, and she worked directly under Rob Wright, and she felt that there was some mishandling when she was asked to step down as the director. She thought there was ableism and ageism and some microaggressions, but all of that was proven to be wrong. It was just kind of an internal conflict. So it's kind of sad seeing this sort of politicization of our holy process that's been happening. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't, do the work of trying to figure out if somebody has done something wrong and then, bringing about restorative justice. But it was clear that this was actually being used in a malicious way. At least that's my reading of it, and talking with our bishops, that they kind of see it in the same light. So that was how we got to this point, and then we had some forums. Yeah, any questions before we get to forums? Okay, so next came an opportunity for all of the Episcopal Church to get to know these candidates. And one of the cool things that the Joint Nominating Committee did was they published 3 essays. One of the essays was about the history of the position of the presiding bishop and how it's evolved over time. It used to just be the senior bishop in terms of order of consecration, and they would just be the presider of the bishops when the bishops would get together for the House of Bishops. And their primary role was not to be the leader of the wider church, but they were responsible for their diocese and then basically running meetings of the House of Bishops. That evolved over time, and it eventually meant that you had to be elected instead of just being the senior bishop, and you had to resign from your diocesan post, and you had to serve the needs of the wider church and not just your diocese. So there was this kind of transition period over the 20th century where all of these things started to happen. Now, the first rector I ever served was a man named Evan Garner, and right before we had our election of the 28th presiding bishop and the confirmation of that by the House of Deputies, he put forth a little post on I think it was on his blog or on his Facebook page. And he said that if the presiding bishop is going to serve the wider church and not just the House of Bishops, should it not be an election of both houses, that both houses have a say, not just in confirming who the House of Bishops says, but also electing them? I don't think he's wrong, even though I don't think that'll ever happen. I mean, I don't think we'll ever get to a place where like the House of Bishops is electing the president of the House of Deputies and vice versa. I don't think that's really ever going to happen. So at General Convention and kind of the lead up to it, the candidates actually participated in a forum, and it was really helpful, and it was pretty fun. That bishops were all they had these introductory videos, and they were really good. They were wonderful videos. They gave us a glimpse into the personality of each of them. But then they had to sit up on stage, and they would pull a little strip of paper from a fishbowl, and it had a different question on it. And so it was a really fun kind of thing to see. And they had different, there's categories like, self-care and wellness, liturgical kind of worship, music, that sort of thing, administration, social justice, so all these different kind of categories that they would have to answer questions on. And it was funny because some of the bishops kept getting the ones that they were really could articulate on. Like Rob Wright kept getting ones on racial reconciliation. He was like, okay, well, I guess I'm going to keep talking about this. Or Sean Rowe kept getting ones about administration, which is his area of giftedness. So it was fun. And what was probably the most beautiful thing about the entire forum was seeing how supportive they were of one another. They had all felt like they were going through this discernment process together. And if there was ego or competitiveness, I didn't see any of it. I mean, which is a testament to them and their character. If you don't know who ends up being the next presiding bishop, I'm going to kind of tip my hand a little bit and tell you something that Sean Rowe said in his intro. He said, "Everyone wants a revolution, but nobody wants to do the dishes," which is a famous line from, it was popularized by Dorothy Day, the Catholic worker movement leader. And then he went on to pronounce, "Our vision of God's reign and our commitment to beloved community are strong, but in the last half century, our institutional structures haven't been working well enough to get us there. The next presiding bishop can't change the course of the church alone, but as the church's chief executive, the presiding bishop must lead that change. Together we can be more faithful, more passionate, and more sustainable as the body of Christ in a world that badly needs our witness." So, last thing that we had to do was actually conduct the election and confirmation. And so on the day of the election, we had this beautiful, spirited service of Holy Communion. I told you all a little bit about it last week. It's mostly in Spanish, but we used the propers for the Holy Spirit, and it was very clear that the Holy Spirit was there. And eventually we kicked out the bishops over to the cathedral so that they could go and vote, and we kept on celebrating as we concluded that service. So then, right before lunch, at the end of our morning legislative session, we had somewhat of a surprise in the House of Deputies. There was a delegation from the House of Bishops that came in and said they had elected someone. They didn't tell us who, but then it was very surprising that it came so quickly, because usually it takes several ballots and a lot of time, and even the president of the House of Deputies had said, we won't even get a name until after lunch. But that wasn't true. So the Joint Nominating Committee from the House of Deputies received the name, and over the course of lunch, they put forth a special resolution that would hold all other business so that we could vote on the confirmation of whoever it would be that would be the next presiding bishop. So what do you do when you're about to confirm the 28th presiding bishop? You pray, and you also eat tacos together. That's one of the most important things you can do. So we had really, really good lunch together as a deputation. And then this is what, there was a resolution several years ago that changed our canon so that we had to be able to see all the results of the ballots in the House of Deputies, so it wasn't just like a secret vote in the House of Bishops. And so you'll note that needed to elect is 82, and Sean Rowe had 89 votes. You might say, oh, he only got 7 votes more than the majority, but you take a look at all the other candidates that he was running against, it's a clear pronouncement from the bishops who they want. Because if you look at the next closest vote getter was Scott Barker with 24 votes. So, I mean, there's a vast difference between Sean and Scott in terms of how many votes they got. So, even though my friend Evan said we should just kind of throw everything into chaos until the House of Deputies gets to vote, I believe in the doctrine and discipline and worship of the Episcopal Church. So I stuck with following procedure and voted to confirm our next presiding bishop. And so it was a really happy moment, and you'll see the response after our resolution to confirm him as the presiding bishop. Now, this guy here is from one of Bishop Rowe's dioceses, and he was really excited that his bishop was now the presiding bishop. All right, so if y'all don't know Bishop Rowe, this is about a 5-minute clip that he put forth during Easter season last year. And so I'm going to play it real quick, and you can get a sense of he has a dry wit, you can get a sense of his humor, you can get a sense of how he sees the gospel as something very much alive, and also something that's, good for us to internalize for ourselves. So here's the Right Reverend Sean Rowe.
The last chapter of Luke's Gospel, we catch two of Jesus' followers in the act of missing the point, which is, if you've read this far into the Gospels, you know is practically their vocation. They are professionals at being confused. They have a gift of never understanding what is happening, and their story is one of my favorite ways of talking about where we find ourselves in the Episcopal Church today. In Luke 24, it's just a few hours after the women went to the tomb and found that the body of Jesus was not there. And so instead of staying to find out what's going on, to check out the story, Cleopas and his companion decide to make their way out of Jerusalem. They're headed the wrong way, out of Jerusalem, away from the disciples, away from the women who had been the last pastors and protectors of the cross and the first ones of the empty tomb. They've heard the good news proclaimed from the first ones to learn that Christ is risen, and they can't get away from it fast enough. Cleopas and his companion heard something unsettling from people who can't possibly be trustworthy, and they are on their way. They're out of there. Not only do they not believe the story, they do not believe that the messengers of that story. Not only do they not believe that Jesus is risen, but it's not really possible that the news that changes everything could come from women. Now, it's easy to mock them until you think about all the ways that we Episcopalians do the same thing. We find ourselves headed in the wrong way on the road to Emmaus when we can't hear the truth from voices that are marginalized, when we can't hear the truth from unlikely sources, from people on the edge, from the people who think we really don't have any business delivering any truth to us. When we can't imagine reorganizing ourselves or restructuring our churches to make room at the center for the voices that God trusts with the truth. Like Cleopas and his companion, we hear those voices and we take off in the other direction, toward the comfort of our institutional structures as they are, our endowments, and the way we've always done it. Thankfully, God does not give up on them or on us. Jesus comes to walk with Cleopas and his companion, but they don't know it is him. As they pour out their tale of woe, they really do start to sound like Episcopalians sometimes. We had hoped that Jesus would be the one to come and redeem Israel, they say. We had hoped. We had hoped our children would find faith in the church in the way that we found it when we were young. We wanted the recipe of Sunday school, church camp, and family devotions that had shaped us to shape them too. We'd hoped that every stewardship campaign would hit its goal, and the chefs behind every pancake supper would have to send somebody out for extra eggs. That everybody we knew would drop in on the parish picnic, and that all our churches would be standing room only on Christmas Eve. And failing that, we hoped at least our children would grow up on a spiritual landscape we still recognized, so that our churches could proclaim the gospel in ways that we understood. We had hoped. But Jesus, by opening the scriptures and breaking the bread, opens their eyes. When the scripture was read to them, and when the bread was broken, their eyes opened. And here's the thing, they didn't even know their eyes were closed until they were opened. Friends, in the next 9 years in the Episcopal Church, we're going to have many opportunities to head the wrong way, away from the voices that God has chosen to bear witness to God's mission in this broken world. But it will also be filled with chances to be freed from the past, from what we had hoped, and marshal our resources to meet the challenges of the future we could not have seen and would not have believed. The next presiding bishop must keep us listening to the voices that can breathe fresh air and new light and life into our beloved church, and help us hear the testimony of the women at the empty tomb, to recognize Jesus on the road, to take the risks that truly opening our eyes requires us to take, and allow us to embrace fully the knowledge that people we don't yet recognize, those on the margin, and sometimes those in the center, will meet us on the road to tell us Christ is risen, and we will never be the same.
What did y'all think? Yeah, I really think our new presiding bishop, and I think his vision is precisely what we need in this moment. He's very different than Presiding Bishop Curry, a very different sort of style of preacher and style of leader, but I think no less inspirational, but perhaps in a different way. So, all right. So we had that election late in General Convention, sort of. I mean, it was on Wednesday of a convention that ended on Friday. So earlier in General Convention, we had the election of our president of the House of Deputies, and it was a whole different process. There's no big, long joint nominating committee. There's not a bunch of stuff that's kind of put forth. It doesn't take 3 years to do this. In truth, the president of the House of Deputies has to run every General Convention. So there's always an election of the president of the House of Deputies. Now, the previous president, the incumbent, can run 2 additional times. And so I'm running out of time, so we had 3 candidates that put forth their names. Julia Ayala Harris of Oklahoma, and she's the incumbent. Zena Link, who's from the Diocese of Western Massachusetts. She was a union organizer for the teachers of Massachusetts. She was the head of all the teachers in Massachusetts, which she had a lot of credibility in, at least from my perspective, because of that role. And then the Reverend Rachel Tabor Hamilton from the Diocese of Olympia. Tabor Hamilton was the vice president of the House of Deputies, elected back in 2022. Is that right? Yeah, 2022. So it was very odd that the vice president was running against the president. It was not common. This is a contested election for the first time since the year 2000, I think, or 2003. And some people think it was a more hotly contested election because at the last General Convention we started this thing of paying the president of the House of Deputies. It used to be an unpaid position, but now it's a contracting position, but the position without benefits, the salary is $236,757, right? So yeah, we're paying this person a lot of money. And so there's kind of a question of, all right, were you doing the work that you needed to do? So then leading up to it, we had these forums that took place to get to know the candidates, and some of those were online. Some of those were conducted by seminaries. They were not super helpful because they were kind of just the exact same. But then there was a forum at General Convention, and you could kind of tell that both Zena Link and Rachel Tabor Hamilton were kind of pointed in their attacks at the sitting president. They were saying that she's not good at communicating, she hadn't done, she didn't have the right experience, all this kind of stuff. And so it was a bad look because we were kind of doing this infighting thing. And then this happened. The day before the election, the vice president released this very, very kind of graphic sort of depiction of how terrible working with Julia Ayala Harris is, and how she had pushed her out and didn't listen to her and all this kind of stuff. It was not very well received. It didn't feel like it was very honest, and it didn't feel like it was a very positive way of trying to kind of rectify what sounded like a hard situation. And so we kind of get to the election, and immediately you can kind of see on the first ballot that people were not interested in listening to somebody kind of coming in the last minute and trying to accuse somebody else. It didn't read very well to everybody else, and Tabor Hamilton only received 64 votes in response to that. And so Julia Ayala Harris was overwhelmingly elected. And I'll tell you that leading up to this, I didn't particularly think negatively of her, of the sitting president, but I also wasn't very impressed. And my vote went to Zena Link. And so when this came back, I was like, oh, well, okay, the will of the House is different than me. And so I tried to kind of be open to what President Harris was doing, and she very much impressed me. She did a phenomenal job throughout the whole time of convention, and talking with other deputies that I trust, my kind of perception of her changed, and I really thought she did a good job. She also is a fun person, so we had to have some sessions at night, and so she gave us some gifts so that we could enjoy what we called Deputies After Dark, or the Episcopal Disco is what we called it. So it was really fun. So once you elect a president, you have to have a vice president of a different order. So Julia is not a clergy person, so the vice president needed to be a clergy person. And so these four folks put themselves forward. The three on the right had kind of put their names forward pretty early. And then John Floberg from South Dakota, he's actually the priest at Standing Rock, if you know that area of our country and the sovereign land of some Native Americans there. Then Charles Graves is a college missioner in the Diocese of Texas. Ruth Myers is a professor at the Church Divinity School of the Pacific and also of the Diocese of California. And this is my friend. You can tell he's my friend because he's wearing a great shirt. Steve Pankey from the Diocese of Kentucky. He's a rector up there. And he was the one that was elected as our vice president. Steve's great. He's very approachable. He's very fun. And he's served with Julia and has a good relationship with her. So those were the big elections. Then we had other elections for executive council, our church pension group trustees. We elected a treasurer, Kurt Barnes of New York, and he's been the treasurer before, a very reputable guy. And sadly, we elected Michael Barlow to be our secretary, but he retired at the end of convention. And Michael Barlow is just one of the most wonderful people you'll ever meet. And he's the one that keeps us on track in the House of Deputies, but his calming voice belongs on like NPR or some other radio station because he just has such a calming presence and demeanor. So these were the elections. It's always hard to mix elections with the church because it kind of runs antithetical to a lot of things. You know, how they figured out who was going to be the disciple to replace Judas was what? Casting lots, right? Like picking straws. So, I mean, that's how we think of elections, I think, in the church, and yet this is where we've come. So come back next week. We'll talk about important resolutions that have an impact on us. Thank you all. Yes? Yes?
What happens to the retiring Bishop Curry? Does he go to passion?
Yes. So, great question. What happens to retiring Bishop Curry, presiding bishop? He gets to do whatever he wants, and the big thing that he said he was going to do is he's finally going to get a dog. Because he's wanted a dog his whole life, and his wife said, as long as you're a bishop and doing all this church work, you don't have time for a dog. But now he has time for a dog, so he's getting a puppy. That's what he said.